Colonel Vance Cordero had always been a man of control, a decorated leader who commanded respect with his mere presence. But here, in the bowels of Tarsus 7, he was stripped of everything: his rank, his dignity, and now his freedom. The cold, unforgiving shackles around his wrists rattled as two massive guards marched him down the claustrophobic steel corridor. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, accompanied only by the distant hum of the prison's automated systems. He wasn't supposed to be here. His mind reeled back to the events that led to this. The trial, if it could even be called that, had been nothing more than a spectacle, a convenient way for Director Reynard to dispose of him. Reynard, a bureaucrat with too much ambition and too little honor, had manufactured the charges out of thin air. Sabotage, conspiracy with alien factions, treason against Earth's interstellar defense forces. Vance had spent his entire life fighting against the very forces Reynard accused him of allying with. It was a calculated move by a man who had always coveted power, and Vance had been too trusting to see it coming. The door at the end of the corridor loomed ahead, a giant slab of metal that separated the guards from the most dangerous prisoners in the galaxy. Block 12 reserved for the worst of the worst. Not just criminals, but beings that had waged war on humanity for decades. Vance had fought these creatures on distant planets, leading countless missions to push them back. He knew their savagery, their cold precision. And now, it seemed, they would be his cellmates. The door opened with a mechanical hiss, and the guard shoved Vance forward. He stumbled, catching himself on the frame, but quickly straightened up. He wouldn't show weakness. Not here. Inside, the room was vast but felt suffocating. The ceiling stretched high, the walls lined with cells that hummed with energy fields, trapping the prisoners in glowing cages. The lighting was dim, casting everything in shades of gray and red. It smelled like burnt metal and damp stone, the kind of place where hope was as scarce as sunlight. Vance's eyes scanned the room, instantly falling on the inmates. His military instincts took over as he sized them up: towering figures with gleaming exoskeletons, others with reptilian features and glowing, predatory eyes. These were not mere criminals, they were soldiers, warlords, and assassins from the most feared species in the galaxy. And now, they were watching him. A low growl rumbled from one of the cells as a figure moved in the shadows. The creature's eyes caught the dim light, reflecting it with an eerie glow. It stood tall, its muscled frame adorned with sharp, jagged scales. Sokoth. Vance recognized the species immediately, a war-hungry race that had nearly wiped out 3 human colonies in the Outer Rim. He had fought them in brutal skirmishes years ago. Their strength was legendary, their ruthlessness unmatched. This one was no different. Another human, the Sokoth hissed, its voice a gravelly growl. And a weak one at that. Vance met its gaze, refusing to be intimidated. He was outnumbered, unarmed, and surrounded by enemies who would love nothing more than to rip him apart, but he had faced worse odds. He had to maintain his composure, not just for himself, but for the slim chance that he might find a way out of this nightmare. The guards moved to seal the door behind him. Vance turned to protest, his voice sharp. "This is a mistake. I don't belong here." One of the guards, a brute of a man in reinforced armor, snorted. "That's not for you to decide, Colonel." He spat the word colonel with disdain, as if Vance's rank meant nothing now. Orders from Director Reynard himself. "You're a traitor, just like the rest of them." Vance's jaw tightened. The thought of Reynard sitting in his cushy office, watching this unfold with that smug grin on his face, fueled his anger. But this was exactly what the director wanted. A broken, humiliated Vance Cordero, powerless and forgotten. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The hum of the force fields resumed, and Vance was now officially one of the inmates. The alien prisoners, who had been whispering among themselves, began to stir. They shifted in their cells, eyes following him as if he were fresh meat tossed into a predator's cage. One of the nearest creatures, a hulking brute with elongated claws and 4 glowing eyes, stepped to the edge of its containment field, its lips curling into a snarl. "You should have stayed in your human wars, soldier," it rasped, its voice slithering through the air like venom. This place belongs to us. Vance took a slow breath. He had faced these creatures before on the battlefield, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was a powder keg waiting to explode, and he was the spark. Then, from the far side of the chamber, a figure emerged, tall and ethereal, moving with a grace that was almost unnatural. It was humanoid, but its skin shimmered with an iridescent hue, shifting between shades of silver and blue. Its eyes, large and piercing, locked onto Vance with a gaze that felt like it was peeling away his defenses, probing his thoughts. "Siri," Vance muttered under his breath. The Exaleth species. He had encountered their kind only once before, in the disastrous assault on Zenthara Prime, a campaign that had nearly cost humanity the war. The Exaleth were known for their telepathic abilities, able to manipulate minds and energy fields with terrifying ease. And now, one of their most powerful was standing before him, sizing him up. "You don't belong here, human," Siri said, her voice calm but echoing inside his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "But neither do we." Vance's eyes narrowed. He could feel the power behind her words, the way they seemed to slip through his thoughts like a cold wind. But there was something else, a sense of restraint, as though she were holding back something far more dangerous. Before he could respond, the lights flickered, and a deafening alarm rang through the chamber. The prisoners tensed, their eyes darting to the ceiling. Vance felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. This wasn't a random power surge. Something was happening. The guard's voice came through the intercom, distorted but unmistakably nervous. "Prisoners, return to your cells immediately. This is a lockdown." Vance's stomach tightened. This was Reynard's doing. He had thrown Vance into a cage with the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy, and now he was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Vance could almost picture him, sitting in the control room, watching it all unfold with cold, calculated precision. But what Reynard didn't know, or maybe he did, was that Vance wasn't going to just survive this. He was going to fight back. As the alarms continued to blare, Vance turned to face the alien inmates, their glowing eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. He straightened his back, squaring his shoulders. If Reynard wanted chaos, he was about to get it. The low hum of the force fields separating the cells echoed faintly through Block 12, intermingling with the distant blare of alarms. Vance leaned against the cold steel wall, his mind racing, eyes scanning the room. He was surrounded by enemies, not just the aliens, but the guards, the system, and the man who put him here. For days now, the tension had been building, a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate. And tonight, with the lockdown in effect, Vance knew it wouldn't be long before the first spark flew. He hadn't spoken much since his arrival, keeping a low profile. It was a survival tactic. The alien inmates were like predators, circling, waiting to see if the lone human would break. Some had jeered, others had stared him down with predatory hunger. Ekron, the hulking Sokoth brute, had been the most vocal, a towering creature of muscle and claws, with a savage thirst for dominance. Vance was no stranger to alien prisons during his military service. He had infiltrated and escaped more than one, but this place was different. Here, the guards didn't maintain order, they cultivated chaos, like farmers tending to crops of violence. Fights were encouraged, power struggles allowed to fester, all part of Reynard's grand design to keep the prisoners too fractured to unite. Tonight, that fragile balance was beginning to shatter. The door to his cell opened with a sharp hiss, and two figures stepped inside. Vance recognized them immediately. One was Ekron, his massive form barely fitting through the doorway, his clawed hands flexing eagerly. Behind him, smaller but no less intimidating, was one of his cronies, the scaly, snake-like creature from the Vengar species, its multiple eyes fixed on Vance with unblinking intensity. Vance didn't move. He'd been expecting this. "Human," Ekron growled, his voice low and guttural. "Your time here is over. We don't need weak prey among us." Vance's gaze never left Ekron's. He could feel the weight of the other prisoners' eyes watching from their cells, waiting to see what would happen. They had been watching since the moment Vance was thrown into Block 12, waiting for him to make a mistake. Ekron stepped closer, his enormous frame casting a long shadow over Vance. His muscles bulged, and the sharp tips of his claws gleamed under the dim light. He clearly expected Vance to back down, to beg for mercy, or at least cower in fear. But Vance was a soldier, not a coward. "You want to kill me?" Vance's voice was calm, his eyes cold. "Then do it. But you'll be fighting the wrong battle." Ekron paused, his black eyes narrowing. The room seemed to grow even more still, the air thick with anticipation. Vance knew how to play the game of dominance. He wasn't here to fight every battle. He was here to win the war. "You think you're strong?" Vance continued, stepping away from the wall and meeting Ekron's gaze head-on. "Your kind never understood strategy. That's why we beat you on Irvine 5. You're all brawn, no brains." A low hiss rose from the Vanguard beside Ekron, and Vance saw its scaled body coil tightly in anger. But Ekron didn't attack. He stood there, towering over Vance, his expression unreadable, though Vance could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You're going to die here, just like the rest of us," Ekron finally said, though his growl lacked the earlier conviction. "And when you do, no one will remember your name." Vance smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I'm still standing now, aren't I?" Ekron snarled, baring his fangs, but before he could respond, something unexpected happened. A soft, almost melodic voice echoed in Vance's mind, cutting through the tension like a knife through water. It wasn't a sound, exactly, but a presence cool, calm, and dangerously intelligent. "Enough. This is pointless." Sairi. From her corner cell, Sairi, the ex-Aleph telepath, had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. Vance had known she was dangerous the moment he'd set eyes on her, but he hadn't expected her to intervene now. "Ekron, your brute strength won't help you escape this place," Sairi's voice reverberated in their minds. "We need strategy, not petty displays of dominance." Ekron's snarl faded, his eyes flicking over to the shimmering figure of Sairi. Her presence was both unnerving and mesmerizing, her skin glowing faintly with an iridescent sheen that shifted in the dim light. The Exaleth were telepaths and energy manipulators, their power not in physical might but in bending reality with their minds. Ekron let out a frustrated growl, backing off a step. "Stay out of this, witch." "I can't," Sairi replied, her mental voice steady. "Because while you're busy posturing, Reynard is preparing to kill us all." At this, Ekron stiffened. The other prisoners, too, seemed to react to Sairi's words. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. They all knew Reynard was playing a larger game, one where their lives were nothing more than pawns in his twisted vision for control. The director of Tarsus 7 was a man with no limits to his cruelty, and they were all at his mercy unless they found a way to turn the tables. "What are you talking about?" Vance asked, his voice low but direct. He had suspected Reynard was up to something larger than just locking him away, but he didn't know the full extent. Sairi's glowing eyes turned to him. "Reynard plans to stage a breakout. But not for your benefit. He'll broadcast it to Earth and the colonies, showcasing the chaos and destruction caused by the dangerous alien prisoners to justify his military expansion. We will be hunted like animals. Every single one of us." A chill ran down Vance's spine. It made sense. Reynard wasn't just running a prison. He was running a spectacle to stage for his rise to power, built on the bodies of both human and alien prisoners. Ekron's fists clenched, and the others around the room shifted uncomfortably. Fear and anger mingled in the air. They all knew they were trapped in Reynard's web. It wasn't a prison, it was an execution ground. "So what do we do?" Vance asked, his voice steadied but filled with the urgency of a man used to commanding troops in life-or-death situations. "You seem to have a plan." Sairi's eyes glimmered. "We escape. But not the way Reynard wants us to. We need to take control of this facility, disable his command center, and shut down his broadcasts before the breakout begins. We have days at most." Ekron, still bristling from the earlier confrontation, stepped forward again, his massive frame casting a long shadow over Vance and Sairi. "And why should we trust you, human? You fought against us. Killed my people. Vance's eyes met Ekron's, unwavering. Because right now, you're not my enemy. Reynard is. And if we don't work together, none of us are getting out of here alive. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, the prisoners shifting uncomfortably in their cells, each contemplating their next move. Trust was not something easily found in Block 12, and the air was thick with the tension of enemies turned tentative allies. Finally, Ekron let out a low, rumbling growl. Fine. We do this your way, human. But if you betray me, I'll rip you apart myself. Vance nodded, his jaw clenched. Fair enough. Cyrie's voice echoed in both their minds, cool and calculating. Good. Then let's begin. The real war starts now. As the alarm continued to blare in the background, the unlikely alliance began to take shape. Human, Sarkith, and Exalith, species that had once been sworn enemies, now united by a common foe. The clock was ticking, and Reynard had no idea what was coming for him. In the heart of Tarsus 7, chaos was about to erupt. The control room of Block 12 hummed with the steady thrum of energy fields and security systems. Vance stood near the edge of the room, his back pressed against the cold, metal wall. His eyes darted over the alien prisoners gathered before him. Ekron and his Sarkith warriors loomed like living mountains on one side, while Cyrie hovered nearby, her eyes half-closed in concentration as she mentally surveyed the guards outside. Other inmates, from a variety of species, all once enemies of humanity, had slowly gathered around. The alliance was fragile. At any moment, the distrust that lingered between them could fracture the uneasy truce. But with each passing second, they inched closer to the moment when their rebellion would begin. Time was running out. Vance could feel it in the way the guards had started pacing more frequently, how the lockdown alarms seemed to flare for longer intervals. Cyrie broke the silence, her telepathic voice softly echoing in everyone's minds. I've probed the guards' minds. Reynard has put the entire prison on high alert, but they still don't know about us. Not yet. Vance nodded, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Cyrie had been feeding him pieces of intel over the last few hours, and he was finally starting to understand the layout of Tarsus VI's twisted command structure. They had the element of surprise for now, but Reynard's plans were already in motion. Soon enough, the director would trigger the false breakout, and the entire galaxy would watch as prisoners, both alien and human, were slaughtered live on broadcast feeds. We need to move faster, Vance said, his voice low and steady. Reynard's going to spin this as a mass riot. We've got maybe 12 hours before the cameras start rolling. Once they do, it's over. The EDF will be ordered to strike down every last one of us. Ekron, standing with his arms crossed and claws glinting under the faint light, grunted in frustration. You talk too much, human. What's the plan? We smash through the guards, take the control room, and kill Reynard. It was a typically Sarkith solution, brute force, simple and brutal. Vance shook his head. If we go in guns blazing, we're finished. We'd be lucky to make it halfway to the control room before they unleash the automated defense drones. Ekron sneered, his muscles tensing. I've killed humans with less than drones. Vance wasn't intimidated by the hulking alien. And what then? Even if we take out the guards, Reynard's watching us right now. He'll lock the facility down tighter than it already is. We'll be trapped like rats. The room fell into a tense silence. They all knew the truth of Vance's words. A frontal assault would end in a massacre. There had to be another way, a smarter way. Cyrie's telepathic voice slipped into the conversation, quiet but forceful. The only way we succeed is by taking control of the prison systems. We need to disable the energy barriers, reroute the power grid, and cut communications. That means we have to get into the primary control hub, located in the central tower. She paused for a moment, her shimmering eyes turning toward Vance. And that's where you come in, Colonel. Vance blinked, caught off guard. Me? Cyrie nodded, stepping closer. You know more about human military tactics than any of us. We'll need to break the encryption codes to access the central hub, override the security systems, and lock out Reynard's control remotely. You're the only one who can do that. Ekron growled, clearly displeased. So we're supposed to put our trust in this human to open the doors? Before Vance could respond, Cyrie's voice once again filled their minds, sharp and authoritative. Vance knows how to beat them. If you want to escape this place, you'll listen to him. Or we all die here. For a brief moment, the room remained on edge, the tension palpable. Vance felt the weight of every prisoner's gaze on him. He knew this plan was risky. Even more than that, it was insane. But it was the only chance they had. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, taking control of the room. We can do this. The key is to hit them from two sides. We split into two teams. Ekron, you and your Sokoth warriors take the primary path. The guards expect you to act aggressively. They'll focus everything on stopping you. Ekron grinned darkly. So we're the distraction? Vance nodded. Exactly. While the guards are busy trying to contain you, I'll lead a second team with Cyrie through the maintenance corridors. We'll infiltrate the control hub, shut down the energy fields, and disable the security system. Once we're in control, the doors will open, and we'll break out. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. It was a bold plan, but it offered the one thing they all craved, freedom. Cyrie nodded in agreement. I'll use my telepathy to mask our presence as long as I can. But we'll have to move quickly. The moment Reynard realizes what we're doing, he'll activate every defense in the prison. Ekron cracked his knuckles, eager for the fight. Fine. But once I'm out, Reynard's mine. Vance met his gaze evenly. Reynard's all yours after we shut this place down. The hours leading up to the breakout were agonizingly tense. Vance and Cyrie led their team of aliens through the narrow maintenance tunnels beneath the prison's main structure, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of the prison's infrastructure and the occasional clang of metal as they passed ventilation shafts. Cyrie walked beside Vance, her expression focused. Every now and then, she would pause, tilting her head slightly as though listening to something only she could hear. Vance knew she was scanning the guards' minds, searching for any sign that they were about to be discovered. They haven't noticed us yet, she whispered into his mind. But we're getting close to the control hub. I can sense it. Vance nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. His body was on high alert, every muscle tense and ready for the inevitable conflict. The small band of aliens following behind him, including a few of Ekron's less aggressive Sokoth, moved with quiet precision. They had put their trust in him, and Vance wasn't going to let them down. When they reached the final stretch of tunnel, Cyrie stopped suddenly. Her eyes widened, her breathing quickened. They know. Vance's heart skipped a beat. How long do we have? Cyrie's voice trembled slightly. Seconds. The guards are moving to intercept Ekron, but Reynard. Her eyes flicked up to the ceiling. He's coming for us. He knows we're heading for the control hub. Vance swore under his breath. They had to act fast. Everyone, move. They raced down the corridor, the control hub looming ahead. The doors were sealed shut, locked by layers of encryption that only human personnel could override. Vance slammed into the panel, his fingers flying across the interface. The code was ancient military standard, but it was one he had memorized from his time in the service. Come on, he muttered under his breath, his fingers dancing across the keypad. Behind him, Cyrie's eyes glowed as she focused her telepathic power on keeping the guards at bay. Her concentration wavered, her breathing heavy, but she was holding them back for now. The panel beeped, and the door slid open with a hiss. Vance didn't hesitate. He rushed inside, his eyes scanning the control hub's consoles. There, on the central panel, was the prison's security grid. One wrong move, and he could lock the entire facility down permanently. Cyrie's voice was sharp in his mind. Vance, hurry. The guards are breaking through. Vance worked quickly, his hands flying over the controls. He bypassed the first set of firewalls, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of 1,000 lives resting on his shoulders. Suddenly, the entire system flickered, and a cold, mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. Alert! Unauthorized access detected. Vance froze. A camera feed appeared on the main screen. Reynard, sitting smugly in his control room, his cold eyes locked on Vance. I see you, Colonel, Reynard's voice crackled over the speakers. And I'm afraid this is where your little rebellion ends. Before Vance could react, the entire room was plunged into darkness. The battle for control had truly begun. For a moment, everything went dark. Vance's heart pounded in his chest as the control room plunged into silence. The cold voice of Director Reynard still echoed in his mind, mocking him. His eyes strained in the blackness, and he could feel the tension rising around him. He wasn't alone in this room. Sci-Fi and the handful of alien prisoners who had followed him stood nearby, their breathing shallow and nervous. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in a dim, red glow. The hum of the prison systems resumed, but something was different. Vance's fingers hovered over the control panel, his pulse racing. He could feel it in his gut. Reynard had activated the prison's deadliest defenses. We've been cut off, Sci-Fi's telepathic voice entered his mind. Her tone was strained, her earlier confidence wavering. Reynard's blocked all access to the central hub. He's locked down the entire facility. Vance cursed under his breath. They were so close, but now it felt as though the walls were closing in on them. He slammed his fist against the console, frustration boiling over. All of this is the planning, the alliance, the sacrifice for nothing? No. He wasn't going to let it end here. Not like this. We're not done yet, Vance muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He glanced over at Sci-Fi, who was already weakened from keeping the guards at bay. Her iridescent skin flickered, the mental strain visible in the way her shoulders sagged. The door to the control room hissed open, and Vance immediately turned, ready for a fight. But instead of guards or drones, it was Ekron who barreled through the doorway, his massive form taking up nearly the entire entrance. His armor was dented, and his claws were dripping with blood, human and alien. His yellow eyes locked onto Vance, a feral grin spreading across his face. Your plan worked, human, Ekron growled, his voice filled with savage glee. We drew the guards away. They're busy fighting for their lives out there. Vance allowed himself a small breath of relief. Ekron's diversion had given them time, but not much. We've got bigger problems now, Vance said, gesturing to the control panels. Reynard's locked everything down. We're trapped unless we take back control of the system. Ekron's grin faded, replaced by a low, angry snarl. Then we kill him. Now. Vance shook his head. It's not that simple. Reynard's sitting behind layers of security and defenses. If we storm his command center, we're walking straight into a massacre. Sci-Fi, her eyes half closed as she regained her composure, stepped forward. There's another way. Both Vance and Ekron turned to her. The XLF telepath's voice wove into their minds like a thread of cool logic. We can still access the prison's core systems through the energy network. If we overload the power grid, we can bring down the security fields long enough to reach Reynard's command center. Ekron frowned. And how do we do that? Vance turned back to the control panel, his mind racing. The prison is powered by an energy reactor deep below the facility. If we overload it, the entire system will go into emergency shutdown. The security grids, the force fields, everything will go offline for at least a few minutes. And then? Ekron asked, his claws flexing in anticipation. Then we strike, Vance said, his voice grim. We take the fight to Reynard before he can recover. It was a desperate plan, but they were out of options. They had one shot at this, one chance to end Reynard's reign of terror and escape with their lives. Vance's fingers flew across the console, accessing the reactor's control systems. He bypassed several layers of security, the familiar military code coming back to him as if he had never left the battlefield. He could feel Cyrie's presence next to him, her telepathic mind reaching out to assist, guiding his thoughts and instincts with precision. Suddenly, the console beeped, and the screen flickered to life. The reactor's core status appeared on the display, showing stable energy levels across the prison's network. "Here we go," Vance muttered. He input the commands to override the reactor's failsafe systems, pushing the power output to its limits. The grid began to surge, the lights flickering once again as the prison's infrastructure groaned under the pressure. Outside the control room, a deafening alarm blared, signaling the overload. The walls trembled slightly, and the air seemed to hum with electricity. Vance could feel the tension in the room building, the ticking seconds counting down to the moment when everything would either fall apart or give them their chance. Cyrie's voice cut through the noise, her mind tense but focused. "The grid's reaching critical levels. We have to move now." Vance nodded, pulling away from the console and turning to Ekron. "Get your people ready. When the fields go down, we make for the command center. It's now or never." Ekron bared his teeth in a savage grin. "I was born ready, human." The halls of Tarsus 7 were in chaos. The once impenetrable energy barriers that lined the corridors flickered and died, leaving only the raw metal walls between the prisoners and the guards. Ekron and his Sokoth warriors tore through the facility like a storm of claws and rage, leaving destruction in their wake. The human guards, already spread thin from the earlier diversion, scrambled to form a defense, but they were no match for the fury of the combined alien forces. Vance led the second group, Cyrie, and a few of the more agile alien prisoners through the winding maintenance shafts toward the command center. Every step they took was filled with the weight of knowing they had minutes at most before the reactor stabilized and the security systems came back online. Cyrie moved beside Vance, her presence calming despite the chaos around them. Her telepathic link allowed them to navigate the labyrinthine corridors without being detected, masking their movements from the few remaining guards who hadn't been drawn to Ekron's assault. Finally, they reached the command center's main entrance, a massive, fortified door flanked by heavy security turrets. The metal gleamed in the dim emergency lighting, a final barrier between them and Reynard. "How are we getting through that?" one of the alien prisoners muttered, eyeing the door with unease. Vance stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "We're not. Cyrie is." Cyrie stepped forward, her eyes glowing with ethereal energy. "Stand back." She raised her hands, and a pulse of shimmering blue light radiated from her body. The air around the door seemed to warp and bend as Cyrie's telepathic powers clashed with the security systems. Sparks flew from the turrets, and the reinforced metal began to buckle under the weight of her mental assault. Vance watched, his heart racing. He had seen telepaths in action before, but never like this. Cyrie's power was raw, unrestrained, the force of nature. The door groaned, and with a final burst of energy, it shattered inward, leaving the path to Reynard open. They stormed into the command center, weapons drawn. Reynard stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by monitors displaying the carnage throughout the prison. His cold, calculating eyes met Vance's, and for the first time, there was no smugness in his expression, only fear. "You've lost, Reynard," Vance said, stepping forward. "This ends now." Reynard's lip curled in a sneer, but there was no defiance in his voice. "You think this changes anything? You're nothing but animals, all of you. The EDF will hunt you down. You'll be dead before you even leave the planet." Cyrie's voice echoed in the room, filled with quiet fury. "No, Reynard. You've lost your power. We control the prison now. And soon, the galaxy will see the truth." With a flick of her wrist, Cyrie sent Reynard crashing to the floor, his body limp and broken. Vance stepped over him, his eyes locked on the monitors. The prison security feeds displayed the chaos outside, the alien prisoners fighting for their freedom. It wasn't perfect. Many would die. But Vance knew, in that moment, that they had won something far more important, the chance to break free from the cycle of violence and control that Reynard had built. He turned to Cyrie, her glowing eyes softening as the tension in the room eased. "Now what?" he asked. She smiled faintly, her voice calm and clear in his mind. Now, we fight for the futures together. As the prison's defenses crumbled and the doors to the outside world slid open, Vance Cordero stood on the threshold of a new beginning. The vast, starlit landscape of Tarsus 7 stretched out before them, endless and free. They had escaped the chaos. Now it was time to build something new.